I'm sure that when it was decided to set T.S. Eliot as an option for Year 12 students in New South Wales to study for their final English exams, it was thought that it would be a help to them that this was a reasonably modern poet. But I think what might have been missed is one thing that makes Eliot so hard, which is his incredibly heavy reliance on allusion and on the idea that his readership would understand all the references he was making. It's a lot easier to look up an archaic word than to really understand what a writer is trying to convey by an allusion that has become archaic because of a difference in geography, class markers, and technology. And Eliot is absolutely riddled with those. It is a lot easier to show a student a picture of a daffodil or a Grecian urn than to convey, unless that student happens to be one of those kids who read Black Beauty as a child, to convey what a cab horse, steams and stamps really means. You can say, look, taxis were invented before cars, and therefore, of course, taxis once were horse-drawn carts, but you don't get the sense of what it's like to see a row of still standing and waiting tired old horses in a chilly evening, making that noise through their nose and creating that steam on a chill night, and followed by the lighting of the gas lamps, a man walking along the street, gradually illuminating it. It's those things that are really difficult, I think, for an Australian teenager to have any hope of understanding why an author might be drawing on that image. So, to try and be helpful, I am going to go through the whole of the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. I'm not talking about meaning very much here, and I'm not really talking about writing techniques. What I'm going to do is I'm going to see if I can just tag every allusion I can find throughout that poem to help you get a full set of images that Eliot would have been assuming his readership had access to.
So right off the top, we have the title and the fact that the poem is referred to as a love song. Now, unless someone told you, you'd really have no reason to know that calling it a song links it to the tradition of the Homeric poets. Sing to me of the wrath of Achilles. You would know that if you had a classical education. Otherwise, it wouldn't even register as something that was an allusion. And then the name Prufrock, which is a made-up name, but I personally believe, that it was chosen to make a sonic chime with the visitor from Porlock of Coleridge fame, which I'm not going to go into detail explaining what that is now because I'll write something about that. But I think the name is chosen so that people who know the story of Coleridge will instinctively link the poem to Xanadu. Then you get this huge quote at the beginning, quotation from Dante's Inferno. Now, sure, your teacher can tell you it's Dante, they can tell you it's Inferno, and you can look at a translation and know that it's someone saying that they hesitate to tell the listener the secrets of their heart for fear of what it would reveal about them. But the fact that it appears there in Italian and isn't in translation, that he hasn't bothered to put in an English version, I think also communicates something. It says to the reader, you are of the class, of the education level that I would expect you too to be a fan of Dante and to understand what this is about and why it's there. So that in itself communicates something apart from the content of the poem. Its existence in that form communicates something between the writer and the reader. Let us go then, you and I. Okay, so then we get to the patient etherized upon a table. Now, the idea of a patient being knocked out in order to operate on them isn't terribly unusual to a modern audience, but I think that's the trouble. We don't realize how the idea of rendering someone unconscious with ether was so radical experimental and a little scary back then. So something that has become more normal to us, the idea of being put under a general anaesthetic, at this time would have been something a lot more menacing. There's also the fact that ether was used to refer to an ephemeral entity in the universe that was often connected with seances, which were popular at the time. So again, you can look up what ether is, you can look up what etherized means, but you'd never really know the resonances that it would have for people in 1915. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets. Okay, so the next time I think there's a reference, an allusion that I don't think a modern Australian student could be expected to know, is down here where it talks about sawdust restaurants and oyster shells. I mean, you could say the same about cheap hotels, but I think they probably haven't changed too much in function over the decades. You can imagine what it is to go away and stay in a cheap hotel. But the fact that restaurants that a tavern really, when we visualize a restaurant, we don't imagine a pub anymore most of the time. And we certainly don't imagine sawdust on the floor for absorbing spills and so on. And oyster shells, we don't know about oyster wives. We don't know about women who sat on the docks and simply just shucked and sold oysters then and there for people to buy and eat. We don't realize that it was cheap day out food. Basically, sawdust restaurants with oyster shells is the equivalent these days would be a pub lunch down by the beach. But to Australians, oysters are kind of fancy. They're a bit posh. So we get we get the wrong impression from this line because we think the person is doing something extravagant or sophisticated when really they were just nipping down to a pub by the beach for a bit of pub grub at lunch. So that's what I'm talking about, how something you can think well, you know what an oyster is referring to a completely alien kind of way of life for us. Then the women come and go talking of Michelangelo, and I'm sure there's lots of conversations going on in classrooms about whether that's rendering the women sophisticated or pretentious or trivial. It could be any of those things. It probably is all at some point. The yellow fog that rubs its back upon the window panes. So I'm sure you're talking about the way the fog is rendered as an animal, but unless you've lived in a city or are aware of cities that relied on coal fires, you don't really know what it's like to have that kind of hanging heavy smog that feels like a being, because the cities, since after coal fires got banned in the middle of the cities, they just cleaned up a lot, frankly. Same with let fall upon its back the soot that falls from chimneys. That's all stuff that was absolutely commonplace back when this poem was written and is now utterly alien to us. We don't see any of that in Sydney, in Australia, in the 21st century. So another one of those examples of things that represents something very mundane to Eliot that would not chime in the same way with us is this reference to toast and tea. Toast and a pot of tea was really the kind of cheap make for yourself filler meal that you could have as a single person or a couple if you weren't sitting down to a proper dinner. And I just don't think we use those things as fillers in quite the same way these days. We don't rely on tea sets and teacups and boiled kettles and teapots nearly as much. But something a little more specific. Down here, when Prufrock refers to his morning coat and his collar mounting firmly to the chin, and his necktie rich and modest, but asserted by a simple pin. Now, no one in Australia even uses morning dress anymore. You would really need to do a search for that and look at what it looks like, and to know that at some point in Australia, for weddings, the the general attire sort of shifted to evening dress from morning dress, and we don't use morning dress in the same way anymore. But to someone from New England in this period, or from England, which Eliot seemed to be reaching towards a lot here, morning coat would mean a wedding. If it doesn't mean a funeral, I suppose part of the point here is that connection, because he's getting old. So you do want to think about what a special occasion it must be for someone to put on their morning coat, and the fact that there was a particular kind of tie you would wear with that, and that it would be vulgar to do something more ornate than having a tie pin in that tie. I have measured out my life with coffee spoons. Again, we don't have, well, maybe we still do have that kind of ritual left when it comes to coffee. Now, here we get on to something that is a little bit more of a literary reference that I think it would be so easy to miss. When he says, I know the voice is dying with a dying fall, I honestly believe, particularly with the word music there immediately in the following line, I don't think anyone who Eliot would consider a reader of his work could hear that phrase, a dying fall, without thinking of Twelfth Night. The very beginning of Twelfth Night, Orsino opens with that really famous line, if music be the food of love, play on, that his appetite may then sicken and die, and not trouble him anymore. But he asked for that phrase again, it had a dying fall, and that was such a famous description of a line of music that I think that is a reference to Twelfth Night without needing to do anything more than that for his audience to know that was what he was talking about. In this next stanza here, you get all this stuff about being stuck on a pin, and it would be sprawling on a pin, pinned and wriggling on the wall. I don't think modern audiences know about butterfly collecting, and that this is very definitely Prufrock being collected like a sample butterfly, because it was such a Victorian habit and not something we really do anymore. I do also think there's a sonic match here between formulated and formaldehyde. So again, taking a specimen and preserving it in your orderly home Victorian collection of pseudo-natural science. And I would recommend going and having a look at pictures of Victorian butterfly collections so you know what he's imagining for himself there. And then it changes to spit out all the butt ends of my days. Now, butt ends are if you're smoking a cigarette, which we just don't, again, see these days in that ubiquitous way where everywhere you went there would be people finishing up cigarettes and ditching them in that way. So he goes on then to this little meditation on femininity, and I think most of that is still fairly accessible, but you might want to look up the word down. Look at how the idea of down is the very fine feathers that you find on baby birds, and so down with light brown hair kind of connects something very mundane, hair on an arm, with the blazoning techniques of love poetry, where you would break down the loved one into tiny individual details that you observe about her, and comparing her the softness of her skin with down is something that would be fairly common in that. And then we wander off along the streets again, and we watch the smoke that rises from the pipes of lonely men in shirt sleeves leaning out of windows. Now, that shows you that they're at home, they're relaxing because they're in shirt sleeves, they've taken their jackets off. So that expression, shirt sleeves, we don't even use that anymore to mean if you're in shirt sleeves, it means you've removed your jacket and are therefore being highly informal. And we all still seem to know what a pipe looks like, but we certainly don't see them smoked around us very much, and we don't notice the division of smoking into cigarettes, which men and women freely smoked, and pipes, which were quite heavily associated with the masculine. And then we get our very super famous pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas. So uh, not just any sea creature, not the whole crab, but just the thing about the crab that grabs your eye when you see it, the ragged claws scuttling. But again, taking us back to those docks with the oyster shells and the trip away to the seaside and the cheap hotel. The event of taking tea in the afternoon we don't really do anymore, and so after tea and cakes and ices, again, we don't really get that would be a low key but special thing to do, to have a nice afternoon tea that included ices, not just bread and butter. So there's some kind of treat going on here. But then we get fancy again and we get a biblical allusion. I've seen my head brought in upon a platter. So obviously that is the head of John the Baptist, called for by Salome on a silver platter, the silver platter that you would normally bring your tea in on for a special occasion. I am no prophet, so John the Baptist being particularly known as the prophet of Jesus. But we're really mashing up our allusions here, because then he goes on to talk about the eternal footman. Now, John the Baptist said that, very famously, that he is not worthy to handle the straps of the sandals of the man who would come after him, referring to Jesus. So I think footman there actually has a little odd connection with John the Baptist there, but it's also this sense of having a servant look after your coat, which we just don't have any experience at all of. I mean, even explaining how common it would be for a footman to be around is really difficult for a modern student, I would think. But to hold my coat and snicker, so he's doing his job, he's putting your coat on, but he's at the same time looking down on Prufrock and making it clear that he doesn't think he's quite good enough. And unless you have a background with that fairly sort of intricate class system that was going on at that time, I think it would be really difficult to understand why he cared about the footman snickering at him. Again, more references to the cups, the marmalade, the tea, and we just don't have that ubiquitous marmalade anymore that just had to be there on every table whenever you had bread and butter or toast. And then we've got Lazarus again, so it's another biblical allusion. So he's staying quite strongly in that area now, but coming back from the dead to tell you all, but to be misinterpreted there. That's not what I meant at all. So we're still going novels, teacups, skirts that trail along the floor. So it's nice, posh afternoon things to do. But don't forget, this is 1915 that he's writing. So by then, most of the skirts wouldn't trail along the floor. You'd have to be of a certain class and of a certain level of formality to be wearing a skirt that was that long. Skirts had already begun to get a little more practical by 1915. And then down here we come to that reference to a magic lantern. And again, that's so tricky, throwing nerves in pattern on a screen. You know how when the optometrist shines a light in your eye and you can see the nerves on the back of your retina? That's something we can visualize there. But it would be so easy to look at magic lantern and think it means something that it doesn't mean. You need to go and look up the history of the magic lantern and the fact that it would be an early way, a pre-cinematic way to show cinematic movement, and that someone, again, probably down by the ocean, charging you a penny to go in and see something special, someone would have a magic lantern to throw slides that were like shadow play and moving images onto a wall, and that was, again, special and a treat, but one that was pretty accessible to almost everyone. So when you see Magic Lantern, don't think about elves and fairies. That's not what that is. It's an early form of cinema. So then we get to the Hamlet stanza. And yes, of course, we've all heard of Hamlet, and your teacher will have told you about Hamlet, but I think you need to know about Polonius too to understand this. The attendant lord, it suggests at first that it's kind of an anonymous lord, a not important one, one who'll just fill out a scene. But then you get down to this deferential, glad to be of use, politic, cautious, and meticulous, full of high sentence, but a bit obtuse, at times, indeed, almost ridiculous. And I think that is definitely a very specific alignment of the speaker with Polonius in Hamlet. But then we get almost at times the fool. And again, I think that takes us back up to that very early reference to Twelfth Night, and just generally in Shakespeare, and the Gravedigger, of course, if we're sticking with Hamlet. But don't forget that the fool in Shakespeare, everyone knew the fool is always the wise one. So that little paradox is in there too. And then we hear about the white flannel trousers, and the trousers rolled, and the walking along the sea. And I think in Australia, we just don't have that sense that those from colder climes, New England, where Eliot was when he wrote this, or England where he moved later, where you might go for a day trip down to Brighton or Worthing, we don't get that sense that the best thing you could do with the beach is take your shoes off. The most decadent thing you could do, take your shoes off, roll the bottoms of your trousers up, and walk along the edge of the waves, because we're so used to just stripping everything off and plunging right in. But our ocean is a very different one from the one that a man of Prufrock's time and class would be engaging with. And then we get the lingering in the chambers of the sea, and this fascinating idea that you can exist under the sea until someone interrupts your dream and makes you realize that this shouldn't be a place that you can exist, and human voices wake us and we drown, which I think is just bringing the whole thing back to a summary of what it was like for Eliot to struggle with being a writer, and that constant sense of trying to grasp something that is just a little out of reach.
So there you have it, a handful of biblical references, a smattering of literary references, a whole bunch of finely variegated class markers, and a bunch of things that Eliot would have had no idea he was being difficult. Tea and toast, anybody?